You are now tuned into the Victim's Advocate podcast with the Victim's Advocate himself, Brandon Stein. Let's get to it.
This is the Victim's Advocate podcast with Brandon Stein. My name is, of course, Brandon Stein. Thanks for joining us. We are still in Diddy world. Trial's still going on. It's probably the only thing that we're going to hear about in terms of media or entertainment for the coming weeks, depending upon how long the trial lasts and how long the jury deliberates. Now, what we had going on the past couple days is we had the prosecution called Gerard Gannon, who testified. He's a Department of Homeland Security lead investigator who headed up the operation that conducted the raid into Diddy's Star Island home down in Miami. Now, one of the purposes for him coming in to testify is there were photos of evidence, and there was specific evidence that was taken out of that home. I mean, it shows his crazy lifestyle, and the photos that we have coming out of the home, whether it's guns, Astroglide, there's just crazy things coming out of the home. So when we look at this, this is just a few, and there's a whole gallery of shoes and sex toys and Astroglide and firearms and bullets and drugs, as we can see here, and looks like bondages or some rope or something. So, when we look at this, obviously it's something that is indicative of a kinky lifestyle. But when we're talking about federal indictments and charges, having a kinky lifestyle is not what's on trial here. And I'm telling you, the defense, that's what they're trying to make this about, that this is just charges that won't stick. These are charges that are not supported by the evidence. And when you look at the evidence, it just shows that Diddy, he was not your I guess customary person when it comes to his sex life or relationships, but that doesn't mean that he's a trafficker. That doesn't mean that he committed racketeering. That does not mean that he should be found guilty on those charges. So when we look at the at the federal indictment, what's really significant is within this indictment we have a core charge here. I mean, the core charge in the indictment is sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. So, and this is the single count in the grand jury indictment that Diddy's on trial for. And we know victim one is the musical performer and his former girlfriend, Cassie, who had testified. She was the first witness to testify. But what this alleges in the grand jury indictment is from at least in or about 2009 up through 2018 in New York, the defendant, who is of course Diddy, he was affecting interstate commerce, and he was recruiting, enticing, transporting, maintaining, and soliciting by any means a person, and knowing and in reckless disregard of the fact, by means of force, threats of force, fraud, and coercion would be used to cause the person to engage in a commercial sex act. And he attempted, aided, and abetted, and caused this person to be harbored or transported in some way. So when we look at these charges in this indictment, that's a very serious charge, no doubt. But why is it significant when they do the raid and they find these bondages, they find drugs, they find firearms? Why is that significant? Because when you're talking about trafficking and when you're talking about these charges, coercion, aiding, abetting, willfully, against someone's will, using force, threats of force, by any means of force, having those pieces of evidence help substantiate these claims. Because during closing arguments, the lawyers can say whatever the heck they want, but ultimately they need to link the indictment and the counts within the charges that Diddy is facing with the evidence presented. So the first and foremost portion of this investigation related to a raid and gathering evidence, and then you come to trial and you have testimony. So it's very, very important to establish this sex trafficking count. You need to show that there was force, there was fraud, there was coercion, and that it wasn't consensual. And that's significant because in the opening statement, the defense and their theory of liability, or not liability, their theory of defense is, hey, look, this was all consensual. Was it customary? No. They were boyfriend, girlfriend, they had a relationship, domestic issues happen, but it was consensual. It doesn't mean it rises to the level of a federal crime, a federal offense. And that's where there's the disconnect between, of course, the U.S. attorneys, the prosecution, and the defense lawyer. So when we look at the next witness that was called, after you have the Homeland Security investigator, he's testifying, hey, listen, this is what I found, this is the evidence, this is what we have. But then the question of coercion, of threat, and you really need to get inside the mind also of the victim, of victim one, let's say Cassie. Was this voluntary? Was this consensual? The prosecution has to show that it wasn't, that they were essentially held against their will, these victims. That victim one, as we saw in that indictment charge, was held against her will, and that she suffered significant abuse. So when we look to who took the stand after, was Dawn Hughes, who's a clinical certified forensic psychologist. Now, she specializes in trauma. She has not spoken to anyone. She's what they call a blind expert, meaning she's testifying based on her experience level. Meaning she hasn't interviewed anyone in the case. She hasn't interviewed the victims. So she's not necessarily competent to testify about the specific victims and their exact experience based on an interview. But what she's testifying to and what she's explaining for the jury is theories surrounding trauma. And when you have these types of events, oftentimes, victims, they may not remember what the abuse is. They may not remember each specific time they were abused. They may only tend to recall certain milestone or landmark events, but ultimately they're not remembering it. And ultimately what she's testifying is that there's a routine that happens, meaning a victim conflates instances of abuse, meaning combines them. No different than any routine of someone. They combine their routine together. It's just the way they remember it. But ultimately, victims are more likely to remember maybe isolated instances of abuse. And she's also testified about how trauma affects memory, and that victims retain core details while maybe some across the side or peripheral ones may fade. Now that's unique to the person, but that's significant in a case like this. And another key point that I saw was that the victims hedge, meaning they don't want themselves to be identified as a victim. They don't want to be known to the public. They don't want to maybe even admit to themselves that they are a victim, or on the flip side, admit that Diddy, in this case, or any of those who Diddy might have directed, was an abuser. They don't want to believe it, or they don't want to put themselves or cast themselves into that category. Now, why is a witness like this significant? Because when you're looking to that trafficking charge, you need to establish key elements. It's all codified. It's all based on statutes, based on law, and that's where the prosecution goes. They need to point evidence and testimony and link it to the elements of the crime. And if the evidence and the testimony beyond a reasonable doubt meets each and every element, then you got to find Diddy guilty, and that's the argument that they're going to raise. So when it comes to this type of clinical psychologist who provides expert testimony, and she's an expert witness, make no bones about it, when she provides this type of testimony, why it's significant is when you look into the mindset and maybe certain holes of stories, or where the defense is maybe trying to poke holes in any of the victims' recount. Like, hey, you don't remember this, you don't remember that, you don't view it this way, do you? You didn't complain at the time, you didn't call 911, you actually showed up, you sent Diddy text messages saying you miss him, or whatever it may be. So when you look to all those facts, there's got to be an explanation psychologically, clinically, as to why a victim reacts that way. Because ultimately, what the defense is doing is they're victim shaming. That's what it is. They're blaming the victim. They're saying, hey, look, you are the reason that any of this happened. You decide to voluntarily go there. You didn't complain at the time. This was happening back in 2009, 2015, 2016. You continued to go and be a part of this lifestyle because you enjoyed it. You didn't run away. You kept going back. You were there. And that's what the defense is trying to do. They're really trying to victim shame and victim blame. And a lot of what I do when I'm representing victims, I see the same, where the big powerful corporation or the big powerful person is trying to blame the victim for falling victim to a criminal act. And ultimately, it's not the victim's fault that they were put into those circumstances. It's not their fault that they can't get out of it. And that's where this clinical psychologist comes in to give the jury an explanation of what's going on inside the mind of these victims, and that, hey, a lot of this is very common from a clinical standpoint when it comes to victims of trauma. And every single victim identified in the federal indictment are victims of trauma. So it was on the prosecution to present an explanation, because they anticipated, I would imagine, where the defense is going to go with this, with the victim shaming, the victim blaming, voluntary, consensual. This is a relationship, it's not a crime. So the prosecution needed to clap back, and they need to have an explanation for it. So when we look to that, it's going to be significant when the prosecution closes their case, and it will be interesting to see who the defense calls. But ultimately, when closing arguments come, you're going to hear about not only what was found in the raid to help support the sex trafficking and the trafficking count, but also you're going to hear about this clinical psychologist who had testified and her explanations of trauma. So it'll be really, really interesting as the case progresses and sees where this goes. But it's a puzzle. It's a big story that the prosecution is putting together, and ultimately it's going to be on the jury to make the decision. And in the end, with juries, you just never know. Talk to you later.
That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on the Victims Advocate podcast with Brandon Stein, and we'll see you on the next one. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at The Victim Advocate, on YouTube at The Victims Advocate, and visit our website at victimadvocate.com.